the studio. Good morning.
Good morning.
And let's begin with the judgment before we move on to Boris Johnson's own position. We've just been hearing Michael Gove, and he said it's often the case that governments have taken decisions that they believe were right, and the court then finds them to be wrong.
I think the government would have had a lot of advice from its own lawyers that to prorogue Parliament for the longest period for 300 years would be questionable, particularly after the Prime Minister had failed to give any undertaking that he would abide by the law Parliament had just passed to prevent us leaving the European Union without any deal, despite there being several votes in Parliament. And so I would have thought it must have been pretty obvious that the course the Prime Minister was set upon was very risky and an affront to our democracy by closing down Parliament to avoid any questions or debate.
But would it necessarily have appeared risky? Because after all, the High Court raised the question of whether judges should be entering into the political arena. And we heard the former Supreme Court Judge Lord Sumption telling this programme that he too would have given that advice had he been Attorney General.
11 Supreme Court judges unanimously came to the conclusion that they did in their decision that the Prime Minister had acted unlawfully. I think that is a very, very serious matter indeed. He clearly has abused the powers he has of the use of the royal prerogative and attempted to close down Parliament. Thank you to the Supreme Court, because we now have Parliament meeting again today, and we will once again be able to question the government on what it is actually doing over taking us out of the EU without any deal, with all the damage that will do to people's jobs and livelihoods.
We know that Boris Johnson has had a conversation with the Queen. Do you think that he should apologise to her?
I think he should apologise both to her for the advice he gave her, but more importantly, apologise to the British people for what he's done in trying to shut down our democracy at a very crucial time when people are very, very worried about what will happen on the 31st of October. You have families that are worried about their future. You have businesses that are worried about their supply chains. You have businesses worried about their exports and all the jobs that go with it.
So what are you going to do about it now? You've called for Boris Johnson to resign, but is that purely rhetorical because you're not actually going to put forward the mechanism which would mean he might have to resign? In other words, a motion of no confidence.
Our priority, and I'm obviously talking to and working with the other opposition parties on this, our priority is to prevent a no-deal exit from the European Union on the 31st of October.
And you do have legislation in place, don't you, which would stop that, the Benn Act, so-called?
We have legislation in place which will stop that happening, that we put through. We also put through a separate binding resolution asking for a statement from the Prime Minister and actions by the Prime Minister who will abide by that legislation. He has so far failed to give those undertakings, and so until it is very, very clear that the application will be made as per the legislation to the European Union to extend our membership until at least January, to give time for discussions on a deal with them, then we will continue pushing for that, and that is our priority, and that is why I'm working with the other opposition parties to achieve that.
So you're making these rhetorical calls for his to resign, but actually you're not going to put forward a motion of no confidence until when? Until after October 31st? Is that when you'll be certain that no deal won't take place?
If the application is made before then and accepted by the European Union at the Ministerial Council on the 17th of October, then obviously that would be a step forward. But I think it's for the government to answer this question. Parliament has legislated. The Prime Minister has said he wants to leave come what may on the 31st of October, and he has closed down Parliament to prevent any further action. The Supreme Court has said that he acted illegally and Parliament has reopened. This is a constitutional problem of huge proportion.
It isn't a problem.
And that's why I called for the Prime Minister to resign, because of the way he's been found badly wanting by the Supreme Court.
But it's a very difficult decision for you, isn't it, as leader of the opposition who's constantly said that you want a general election, that you're calling for him to resign, and then for reasons of tactics not being able to do it. And I have heard that it was actually you were going to call for it in your conference speech and then decided not to at the last minute.
You must have seen a version of the conference speech that completely bypassed me because it was never in any part of the conference speech.
Well, nonetheless, you are in the position of being able to be taunted, aren't you, by Boris Johnson? He's already said that this is the fact that you won't go for a general election is preposterous cowardice.
Boris Johnson loves waving his arms around and shouting these kind of ludicrous remarks. Quite simply, our first priority is to prevent a no-deal exit from the EU on the 31st of October. We have made that clear all along. That is why we supported the cross-party legislation to force the government to apply to the EU. And it is very detailed, that legislation. It even sets out in terms the letter that the Prime Minister must send to the EU. He has refused to give the undertaking that he will do that. No application has so far been made to the EU. And so far as I'm aware, no proposal on a future agreement with the EU has been made either. That was always our priority and remains our priority. At that point, it would be appropriate to move a motion of no confidence in order to force the government to resign and to have a general election.
Isn't it as simple? If you don't have the votes and you know that if you put forward the motion of no confidence, you'd lose it because many of the independent Conservatives, people like David Gauke, have said that they wouldn't support you in that motion of no confidence.
Well, it's up to them how they vote. It's up to every MP how they vote in a motion of no confidence. But we have said our priority is to prevent a no-deal exit. And at that point, when that has been achieved, the preventing of a no-deal exit, we will then be ready with a motion of no confidence.
The accusation is that the reason you don't want to call a general election now is that you are scared of having an election. If you look at what's been happening in the opinion polls, there are open divisions in your party, there have been accusations of anti-Semitism. Your own ratings have dropped massively since 2017, down to -60 now.
I'm very happy to have a general election when we've taken no deal off the table and the EU has granted that extension. We're ready for it then. Our conference came together on all these issues, and we as a party are very well organised and very ready to go out campaigning. And during an election campaign, the broadcasting rules kick in and we get equal coverage with the other parties, which doesn't always feel like the case between elections.
But nonetheless, you must admit these aren't the easiest conditions for you to be going into a general election, given all the problems that the government has faced. Boris Johnson's lost several senior politicians, every vote since he was Prime Minister, and now the Supreme Court ruling. How much worse do things have to get? And still, you're not ahead of him as the opposition.
We've defeated this government 44 times since I became leader of the party. We have prevented so far a no-deal exit from the European Union, and we were the first opposition ever to do it, to find a government to be in contempt of Parliament when under Theresa May they refused to reveal the legal advice they've been given.
I think why is that filtering through to voters then?
Well, I think we've been a very effective opposition, and I think the programme we're putting forward of the ending of austerity, of investment in the worst hit communities across this country and dealing with the horrible inequalities that exist in Britain, I think that is something that will be very attractive to the voters of this country.
Could it be because of your ambiguous position, as some would characterise it, on Brexit? I mean, for example, in your own constituency, Islington in London, what would you say to somebody there who supported Remain? Wouldn't the automatic thing for them to do be to vote Liberal Democrat?
Not at all, because if they vote Liberal Democrat, they're voting for a party that brought austerity to this country and brought the cuts in welfare benefits and brought the slashing of local government spending.
But if they care mostly about Brexit, which a lot of people do.
Well, they care about Brexit. They also care about a lot of other things in their lives. I would simply say that we will go into the election saying that we will negotiate what we consider to be an appropriate relationship with the EU outside the EU and put that alongside Remain in a public vote, a referendum to the people of this country as a final decision to be made by the people of this country. Until a very short time ago, the Liberal Democrats and others were calling for a referendum. They've now decided they don't want a referendum. They want to cancel the result of the first referendum.
And you won't make
My whole strategy has been to bring people together, both in my party and outside. And a lot of people actually think, well, actually, that is quite sensible, because we have to be able to say to the whole country, in the finality, it will be your decision. These are what we think are credible options to put before you.
People will be looking to you for leadership, and there's already going to be quite a lot of delay because you're having an election, you're going to negotiate a deal, then there's going to be a one-day special conference before deciding anything. Once the party's made its position clear, will you?
Well, that's the point, obviously, when we'll decide what we do as a party.
But what will you do? Will you say, I'm for Remain or the deal?
I work with and for and in and by the Labour Party, so that's where I'll be.
And on this question of negotiating a deal, because you want that to be an option on any referendum ballot paper, what deal could possibly be better than staying in the European Union from a Labour perspective? The reason I say that is I spoke to your Shadow Chancellor on Monday, John McDonnell, and he said he couldn't envisage one.
There are problems with the European Union structures. There are problems with its development towards a market economy in some ways. And in the referendum campaign in 2016, I campaigned yes to remain, but also I campaigned for reform within the European Union, and I've worked within the Party of European Socialists. That's the aggregation of all the.
That's reform while staying in, though, isn't it? That's reform within it, not leaving it with a different deal.
Exactly my point, and that's what I said in 2016. The referendum result was that we leave the EU 52 to 48. I think we have to respect that result, which is what we've done. Therefore, I think it's appropriate that we say at the end of all this, this is the choice. Either you leave on these terms, which maintains a trading and rights relationship, or you remain within the European Union. But the idea that we should just crash out without a deal is very, very dangerous, unless
but hang on,
that's the only objective is to have some kind of very one-sided trade deal with the United States.
But lots of the senior people around you, your Shadow Chancellor, your Shadow Foreign Secretary, your Shadow Brexit Secretary, all think that the position of the party should be Remain.
They have their view. There are many others in the Shadow Cabinet who hold a different view, who are not so public about it. And there are.
Do you think these people shouldn't be public? People like Emily Thornberry should now toe the line?
People have developed their own opinions, and I'm interested to listen to them. But what I do say is our party conference debated this matter at enormous length last year and this year, and came to a position which is, of the paper that I put forward, which is that we will develop that relationship, put it to them, and then take a public vote.
Well, why not have a public vote immediately, which is becoming a more popular position in your party? Barry Gardner speaks for international trade. He says that there should be a referendum before an election. He said there's a logic to holding one to get the issue of Brexit done and dusted.
Because at the moment there is no agreement been put to the European Union that we could accept around what I called the 5 pillars when we put it forward earlier, which Keir Starmer and I spent a lot of time talking to the European Union about. Boris Johnson clearly is not going to put that forward, and if Boris Johnson leaves office over the next few days and another Tory takes over, I think that would be the same position. I think it does require a Labour government that would actually be serious about the relationship.
And just one final question on what's going to be happening in Parliament. There's likely to be a vote on whether there should be a recess for the Conservative Party conference. Would you allow that to happen?
I won't support anything that shuts down Parliament until it is absolutely clear that the government will abide by the European Union law that we passed in Parliament and make the application, and the application is clearly acceptable to the European Union. I don't see why Boris Johnson and his team should be allowed to run away from accountability yet again.
Now, in normal times, and obviously these are not normal times, we'd be talking to you a lot about the many policies that you'd announced at your party conference. A big one in the speech yesterday was about drug companies. You want to override the patents of companies that you think are overcharging. But these are multinational companies. If you do that, if elected, wouldn't they just leave Britain?
They are making a great deal of money out of our National Health Service. And I used the example yesterday of Orkambi, the drug which deals with people with cystic fibrosis, costs per patient £100,000 per year. The NHS have been trying to negotiate with the suppliers. They cannot reach an agreement, hence it is not available for patients in
And
this
that
country.
may well be the case,
No,
but if the reality of it, isn't it, pragmatically, the companies will just go and there could be a real loss of jobs in skilled areas.
No, it will not be companies that go and there's a loss of jobs. What it will be is us saying to big pharma companies, you have made a great deal of money out of our National Health Service. We recognise there are costs of research and costs of development, but we still think you can have generic medicines at a reasonable price that does reflect those investment costs. And we will also, over the longer term, set up our own drug research and manufacturing organisation. But it would also say big pharma companies get a great deal of public subsidy for the research they do and then own the patents at the end of it. Surely there's a public interest in the public owning the patents. South Africa went through this battle with big pharma over antiretroviral drugs many years ago. Fortunately, South Africa won that battle, and many people in South Africa now get reasonably priced Indian-made antiretrovirals. I think it's time that we shared the benefits of research and shared the benefits of medical advance for everybody rather than denied it to them.
On private schools, the idea of seizing land from schools, John McDonnell says this isn't about seizing property, it's about having access. So are you moving away from the composite motion which said that endowments, investments and properties held by private schools have to be redistributed democratically?
That is what was put forward in that proposal. What we're saying at the moment is we want to see a taxation system, a fair taxation system that doesn't in reality subsidise private education. I want to see the best investment in education for every child, and that means I think it's reasonable that those that own private schools should pay tax on them and the charitable status should end.
But that's different from seizing their land. Are you moving away from that?
There is an issue about land ownership and who actually owns it and where it's come from, but that is not the immediate issue. The immediate issue is the end of charitable status and taxation.
And that could be against the law, couldn't it? It could be against the European Convention.
Well, education is also a human right under the Human Rights Convention, and in some countries it is not allowed to charge for education in any form. Finland, for example, I believe.
Now, another thing that was voted on this week was to have a climate change target of 2030 as opposed to a government target of 2050. Is that something that you would implement as a priority as Prime Minister?
It has to be a priority for all of us. It is an ambitious target. It won't be easy to achieve it, but unless we go forward to do everything we possibly can to reduce emissions, get to net zero as quickly as possible, then what are we doing? Polluting our seas, polluting our rivers, polluting our air, and actually creating a climate disaster.
Because the government target of 2050, the government suggests, would cost £1 trillion.
It's going to cost a lot of money all around the world to deal with the climate crisis. But if we don't, then we're going to see more extreme weather patterns, we're going to see rising sea levels, we're going to see the loss of biodiversity and ultimately the damage to all of our lives. This is a massive international, global wake-up call that every country has to respond to.
Jeremy Corbyn, Leader of the Opposition, thank you for talking to us.
And at 20